Everyone ignored the millionaire's deaf daughter until a waitress changed everything. The reservation had been under the name Whitfield. Table for 5. And by the time the family was seated at Belmore, the kind of restaurant where the bread came with 3 types of butter, and nobody asked what things cost, the tension at the table had already occurred. Led into something Maren Isley could feel from 20 feet away. Maren had been waiting tables at Belmore for 2 years, long enough to read a table before she reached it. This one told her everything in a glance: a millionaire in a pinstriped suit, a wife glittering in dark green silk, an older couple who carried themselves like they were used to being the most important people in any room, a teenage girl in her own quiet orbit of boredom, and, at the center of it all, a little girl, maybe 8, sitting very still, with her hands folded in her lap, eyes darting between the adults' moving mouths, with the particular exhaustion of someone trying to read a conversation she couldn't hear. Maren clocked the hearing aids, half hidden beneath the girl's hair, before she reached the table. She also clocked, within about 90 seconds of taking the order, that nobody at that table was including the girl in anything at all. "She'll have the same as her mother," the man said, not glancing down at his daughter when Maren asked what the little girl would like. "Whatever's simplest." The girl, her name Maren would learn, was Poppy. Looked down at her folded hands and said nothing, because nobody had actually asked her. Maren Isley was 26, the daughter of 2 deaf parents, raised in a house where American Sign Language had been her first language before. English was her second. She'd grown up interpreting for her parents at parent-teacher conferences, doctor's appointments, DMV counters, learning early and thoroughly what it looked like when a room full of hearing people simply stopped making room for someone who couldn't hear them, not out of cruelty, usually, but out of a kind of thoughtless convenience. The same way people forget to hold a door. She recognized that particular flavor of neglect instantly at the Whitfield table. It wasn't hostility. It was worse. In its own quiet way, it was a family that had simply stopped trying. When she came back to take drink orders, she crouched slightly at Poppy's side of the table, at the girl's eye level, and signed instead of speaking. "I know some sign language. What would you like to drink?" Poppy's whole face changed. Not surprise, exactly, something closer to relief. The specific relief of being seen after a long stretch of not being. "You know. ASL. Poppy signed back, fingers quick, delighted. "My parents are deaf," Maren signed. "I grew up signing." The rest of the table had gone quiet, watching this exchange with expressions ranging from confusion to something that looked, on the father's face, almost like shame. Nathaniel Whitfield had built his fortune in commercial real estate over 18 years. The kind of relentless expansion that left very little room for anything that didn't move the business forward. He loved his daughter, that was never in question. Not really, but love, in Nathaniel's house, had quietly calcified into logistics. Poppy had lost most of her hearing to meningitis at 18 months old. Nathaniel and his wife, Caroline, had done everything the doctors recommended: cochlear implant evaluation, hearing aids, a private tutor. What they hadn't done, in 6 years, was learn to sign, not properly, not beyond the handful of gestures Poppy had cobbled together herself out of necessity, because nobody around her had ever cared enough to meet her halfway in a language built for her. Tonight's dinner was supposed to be a small triumph. In Nathaniel's mind, his parents in town, his business partner's family joining for the evening, a nice restaurant to mark the closing of a deal he'd been chasing for months. He hadn't thought, until this moment, watching a waitress crouch down and speak his daughter's language more fluently than he ever had, about how many dinners Poppy had sat through exactly like this one, present, seated, fed, and completely alone in a room full of people who loved her. "You sign," he said to Maren. When she straightened back up, it wasn't quite a question. "My parents are deaf," Maren said again gently. "I've been signing since before I could talk." Basically, Nathaniel looked at his daughter, really looked at her. The way she was watching Maren's hands with an attention she hadn't shown anyone else at the table all evening. And something in his expression cracked open, just slightly. What happened over the next hour wasn't dramatic. Not in the way television makes these moments dramatic. Maren didn't lecture the family. She didn't need to. She simply did her job the way she always did it, checking in, refilling water, describing the specials, except every time she reached the Whitfield table. She crouched to Poppy's eye level and signed directly to her first, asking what she wanted, what she thought of her food, whether she was having a good time, before turning to take the rest of the table's order. By the second course, Poppy was signing full sentences back, animated in a way that made her grandmother, the older woman in the group, whom Maren would later learn was named Eleanor, actually reach for her phone and quietly type ASL classes near me under the table. Watching her granddaughter's hands move with an expression that looked a great deal like grief for time already lost. By dessert, something had shifted at the table that had nothing to do with Maren directly. Nathaniel had pulled his chair slightly closer to Poppy's. Caroline was watching her daughter's face, instead of her own reflection in the window. The teenage girl, Poppy's older sister, Isla, had put her phone away entirely and was leaning in, asking Maren, in a hesitant voice, how to sign "I love you," practicing it under the table until she got the handshape right. "Why didn't we do this sooner?" Nathaniel asked Maren quietly. Near the end of the meal, when the rest of the table had drifted into their own quiet moment with Poppy, it wasn't really a question aimed at her. It was the kind of question people ask out loud when they already know the answer and don't like it. "People get comfortable not doing hard things," Maren said carefully. "Even when the hard thing is the only thing that actually matters to the person you love. It's never too late to start. That's the part people forget." Nathaniel didn't leave it there. 2 days later, Maren received a message through the restaurant's manager, a request, respectfully worded, for Maren to consider a private arrangement, paid work, well outside her regular waitressing hours, teaching the entire Whitfield family American Sign Language, starting with Nathaniel and Caroline, and extending to grandparents and Isla as well. Maren almost said no, on instinct. She wasn't a certified ASL instructor, just a fluent native signer who'd never formally taught anyone. But she thought about Poppy's face at that table. The specific loneliness she'd recognized instantly because she'd watched her own parents live inside a version of it for years. And she said yes on the condition that the lessons be treated seriously, real homework, real practice. Not a hobby abandoned after a few sessions once the novelty wore off. Nathaniel agreed to every condition without negotiating a single one, which told Maren more about his sincerity than anything he'd said at the table. The lessons ran for 8 months. Nathaniel, it turned out, was terrible at first, his big hands clumsy with hand shapes that came naturally to an 8-year-old, his pace frustratingly slow next to his daughter's fluency. Built out of 6 years of necessity he'd never bothered to share, but he showed up every week without fail. Canceling business calls that 6 months earlier would have been unquestionably more important than this. Caroline improved faster. Driven by a specific and quiet guilt, she confided in Maren only once, admitting she'd told herself for years that Poppy's hearing aids meant she was basically fine, a story she'd needed to believe more than Poppy had ever needed her to believe it. Poppy, for her part, bloomed in a way that had nothing to do with grades or hearing aids or any of the metrics her parents had spent 6 years quietly tracking. She started talking signing at dinner every night, not just answering questions but volunteering thoughts, jokes, complaints about her sister, the ordinary noise of a kid who finally trusted that someone in the room could actually understand her. A year after that first dinner at Belmore, the Whitfield family came back the same table. If Maren could arrange it, which she could, because Nathaniel had specifically asked. This time, when Maren approached the table, she didn't need to crouch down and translate for anyone. Nathaniel signed the drink order himself. Slow, but clear. Caroline signed a joke to Poppy that made her daughter laugh loud enough to turn heads at the next table over. Eleanor, the grandmother, had gotten good enough by then to sign an entire halting but genuine apology to her granddaughter for the 6 years it had taken her to learn, which Poppy waved off with the effortless forgiveness only children seem to have any real supply of. Isla, now 17, had gone further than anyone. She'd started volunteering at a summer camp for deaf and hard-of-hearing kids, telling Maren she wanted to study deaf education in college, a path that hadn't existed in her imagination at all until one dinner where a waitress crouched down and did something as simple as asking her sister what she wanted to eat. Maren still works at Belmore, though she's cut back her hours. The ASL lessons had turned, over that year, into something bigger than she'd planned. a small but growing practice teaching hearing families of deaf children, referred almost entirely by word of mouth, that had started with one uncomfortable dinner and a father brave enough to ask himself an honest question about why it had taken so long. She keeps in touch with Poppy still, mostly through video messages. The girl sends her in fluent, joyful sign updates about school, about her sister, about a father who, 6 years too late by his own reckoning, had finally learned to speak his daughter's language. One clumsy handshake at a time. Nobody at that first dinner had meant to be cruel. That was. Maren had come to believe, the most important part of the whole story, that neglect rarely announces itself as neglect. It just looks like everyone in the room being a little too busy, a little too comfortable, a little too used to a language that worked fine for everyone except the one person who mattered most. It took a stranger crouching down to eye level for exactly as long as it takes to ask a simple question, to remind an entire family what they'd been missing all along. The end.